Good morning, or afternoon. Happy Sunday, or Monday, or Tuesday, or whatever day it is that you get around to watching this, if you actually are watching this. It's a new world out there, and I don't really know what to think about a lot of it. Talking to a camera still isn't my favorite thing, but here we are. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about why this is what we're doing here in a second, but I want to take a minute and reiterate something that I think is important. I know, and we'll get into this even more soon, I know there's a lot of disagreement, there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of this side versus that side. I feel like I'm torn in the middle of it a lot of the times. And I say things and I do things. Not everyone likes it. But that's the burden of leadership. That's the burden of being a pastor. But I want to be held accountable too. So I want you to know a couple things about pastors in the Nazarene Church before I go into this sermon. Because this sermon will probably not be something everyone likes. But no sermon I have preached lately has been received unanimously as good or wonderful. And that's okay. We live in a weird world right now. But per our polity, our Nazarene manual says that there's a couple things I'm supposed to do, and I try to do them. I could do better. I could be better at it. But the top three job duties, responsibilities for me as a pastor are to pray, to preach the word, and to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. If you're really interested in reading up on this stuff, it's in the Nazarene manual, and it's section 515.1, point 2, and point 3. But section 515 is like pages long for what a pastor is supposed to do. And I've talked with your board, my accountability on what is realistic for someone who has to stay home with kids a lot. And they have agreed with me that those top three things are the priorities, that my time should be dedicated to those things, which is why I still make these videos and why I do my best to be praying for all of you. And why I spend a lot of time equipping saints for work in the ministry. That's why I kind of come across sometimes as intense, because these are important things. There's a lot in this world that vies for your attention, to teach you something else than perhaps the Word, the Bible itself, that tries to disciple you, inform you in some other way. So there's competition for me as a pastor, especially now, especially today. I'm recording this sermon on a Saturday, and yesterday the state mandated that we're supposed to wear masks, and there's a lot of opinions on that. And it genuinely probably will make my life, my job a little more difficult, especially since I have already been told a number of opinions on whether people will or will not wear a mask. And even though I've preached on this before and talked about legacy and what legacy we're willing to leave behind, is it one that shows that we feel that we can be inconvenienced and practice self-sacrificing love and care about the words of Jesus, the last line of the Sermon on the Mount, treat other people the way you want to be treated. Do we care about those things? Do we care about the greatest commandment enough to be slightly inconvenienced to wear a mask? Or do we want to be known by something else? And some, as I see it, are already answering that question. They're more concerned about their personal rights and freedoms. They're more concerned about the Constitution than maybe even the Bible or the words of Jesus. And that may be a tough thing to hear a pastor say, but you can tell by people's actions, by what they're willing to do, by how they behave, by how they treat other people. Jesus himself said, "You will be known as my followers by the way you love." He didn't say you'll be known as my followers by the way you stand up for this or that American right. But this is a time where American rights, where this Constitution, where the government and the church have this tenuous relationship where sometimes it works and other times we're at odds with each other. And I genuinely wonder what we are to do about it. But as a pastor, and since it's my duty to preach the word, of course, I'm going to go to the Bible. There's a chapter that's pretty famous for times like this. It's called it's not called, I guess, anything. It's just Romans 13. It's the submit to the authority that God has placed in the government. And oftentimes this chapter is used inappropriately. You can tell when it's used, when it's not just read and appreciated for what it is, but when it's actually used. It's always used when the person that just quotes a couple verses does so in a way that shows that they really like what the government is doing. But then anytime the government does something they don't like and someone else uses it to remind them that they once used it that way, they get very upset. It's not as simple as all that. Let's just talk about it for a second. This is Romans chapter 13. If you have the Bible Companion, you can find this chapter in there, but I'm also going to refer to Romans 12 and a couple other sections of Scripture. So I'm just going to put Romans 13 in the Bible Companion to keep it simple. You can find the other chapters later on this week or in your discussion together. But let's read it. Remember, the government just told us to wear masks. Every person should place themselves under the authority of the government. There isn't any authority unless it comes from God, and the authorities that are there have been put in place by God. So anyone who opposes the authority is standing against what God has established. People who take this kind of stand will be punished. Now, I'm going to say something, and I'll come back to it in a second, but we need to remember that Paul wrote this at a certain time in his life where he had already stand opposed to the government and the authorities. He probably wrote this around the time in Acts chapter 20-ish, where he was trying to get back to Rome. But Paul had a habit of being arrested already. In Acts chapter 16, he had been arrested. He was with Silas, and they were arrested for, as they say in Acts chapter 16, it's verses 16 through 40, advocating customs that were unlawful. Simply what they were doing is actually claiming allegiance to Jesus Christ despite his crucifixion, and not to Caesar, not to Rome. So that was treason. So again, let's reread that in context and understand Paul's saying something here that's important, and it's pretty clear to me what he's saying. And I'm not the only one that thinks this. This is something that has been part of Orthodox Christianity pretty much since Paul talked about this stuff, because if you may not know, history shows that sometimes the church doesn't agree with the government, and there might be some explanation as to when that's permissible according to the Bible. Every person should place himself under the authority of the government. There isn't any authority unless it comes from God, and the authorities that are there have been put in place by God. So anyone who opposes the authority is standing against what God has established. People who take this kind of stand will be punished. The authorities don't frighten people who are doing the right thing. Rather, they frighten people who are doing wrong. Would you rather not be afraid of authority? Do what's right, and you will receive its approval. It is God's servant given your benefit. But if you do what's wrong, be afraid, because it doesn't have weapons to enforce the law for nothing. It is God's servant put in place to carry out his punishment on those who are doing what is wrong. That is why it is necessary to place yourself under the government's authority, not only to avoid God's punishment, but also for the sake of your conscience. You should also pay taxes for the same reason, because the authorities are God's assistants concerned with this very thing. So pay everyone what you owe them. Pay the taxes you owe. Pay the duties you are charged. Give respect to those you should respect, and honor those you should honor. Now, I find this ironic. I have never once seen someone use Romans 13 to justify why they should be taxed. And the irony for me is that they were oppressed people that were being taxed. That the Jews and Gentiles under the Roman occupation were being taxed for ridiculous amounts of things, overly taxed. And even Jesus himself said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. You will never see someone go toe-to-toe with someone else and justify their taxes being used for X, Y, and Z because the Bible, even though Paul kind of just lays it out like you should pay taxes. That is what the government's there for, is to take that money and do it as sees fit. But I have heard numerous self-proclaimed followers of Jesus talk about how their taxes will and cannot be used for this, that, or the other, and that they have rights and they have this, that, or the other. Take Paul's words for what you will, but Paul is saying something pretty clear here. He continues, said, don't be in debt to anyone except for the obligation to love each other. Whoever loves another person has fulfilled the law. The commandments, do not commit adultery, don't murder, don't steal, don't desire what others have, and any other commandments are all summed up in one word: you must love your neighbor as yourself. Love doesn't do anything wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is what fulfills the law. So, oftentimes when this Romans 13 is quoted, people stop after maybe verse 3 or 4, and they just simply talk about the authority God has placed and don't oppose it. Now, certain people have famously used those first couple verses to bolster their own power and opinion. One of the most notable and famous individuals that did this was Adolf Hitler. Now, I think it stands to reason that maybe Adolf Hitler was misusing this couple verses. He was doing something called proof texting, because obviously what he was doing was wrong and evil, and Paul makes that clear because in context, Paul basically says that this love is what fulfills the law, that the law of love is what governments are supposed to uphold. They are supposed to be these moral institutions that are ethical, that do what is best for all, which is why he talks about committing adultery and murder and stealing. If someone steals, they will be punished by these governments. If they murder, they will also be punished by these governments, which is why, as Paul says, they are given weapons, they are given swords, whatever your version of the Bible uses there. Mine says weapons to enforce the law. That is what they are there for. This is what God has placed them in authority to do. But, believe it or not, governments get it wrong. And there's a difference between the government getting it wrong and your personal opinion for what the government should or should not do. Right now, this chapter is on a lot of people's minds as I have seen them share it, time and time again, based on their opinion of something as simple as wearing a mask. There's a couple things that I think are really important for us to take away from this passage, because not only is Paul saying that the government is supposed to be put in authority to do what is good for all, to do what is best for all, but that as a Christian, we're supposed to do things that are good for all as well. And not only is that said in verses 8, 9, and 10, but in chapter 12, Paul has already made this pretty clear. That at the start of chapter 12 in Romans, Paul says, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer yourselves as living sacrifices. A living sacrifice. Sounds pretty inconvenient. Almost as inconvenient as wearing a mask. Holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve God's will, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Paul in verse 3, 4, 5, 6, and 3 through 8, I'm not going to say all the words. He talks about humble service, that we're supposed to be humble, and we are part of a body with many members, that we have to be basically considerate of other people in their gifts and what they contribute. Then he talks about love in action right before he talks about submitting to the authorities. He says love must be sincere in verse 9. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need, and practice hospitality. He talks about blessing those who persecute you, rejoicing with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn, live in harmony with one another. Don't be proud, but willing to associate with people of low position. Don't repay anyone evil for evil, but be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Don't take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. And then he talks about how if your enemy is hungry, feed him, and if he is thirsty, give him something to drink. And in doing this, you'll burn heaping coals on their head. Don't overcome evil with evil, but overcome it with good. Now, all of this continues to continue this similar thread, this similar vein of what it means to truly, in a self-sacrificial way, love other people. It's a significant thing that Paul is saying, to be humble, to let your actions be loving, to be sincere, to care for other people, maybe even more than yourself, which is exactly what Jesus said. After this section where Paul talks about the law of love and caring for other people more than yourself. He talks about the day being near. And he talks about the future of the church and all these interesting things. He talks about what it means to be a person of faith, about what is most important, and that's what I want to focus on for the rest of the sermon today. Paul is telling these people something that's not just important for their time, but for our time as well. At that point, basically, they were having to make decisions about what they were willing to do, how they were willing to live. And at some point, the laws of man, human laws, put them in violation of God's law. That Paul was laying out what the laws of humanity are supposed to be, that's what God put them in authority to do, to be for the good of all. But even Paul violated those laws and came under the authority of human governments and was imprisoned and eventually killed. And the reason that he did what he did was because at some point he had to choose who he was going to serve. That at some point Paul chose to call Jesus king and not Caesar. And that was political. Now this word political and politics, it is causing quite a stir in conversations that I see or I am privy to today. Because churches aren't supposed to be political, and neither are pastors. I don't agree. I know I've even said that we shouldn't be political. But what I think that actually means, what I've learned as of late, what I've come to realize is that simply doing something as basic as asking people to wear a mask has become political. Now, when I have said in the past that churches and pastors should not be political, or maybe lately you've heard me say they should not be partisan, that is what I really mean, and that's what we still believe today. That a pastor should not say, this political party is right and this one is wrong, so therefore this is the political candidate God has told you to vote. Even John Wesley said, you should vote your conscience and not begrudge someone that votes differently than you. And you should probably even pray for the person you didn't vote for. That this is just basic Christian practices. But the mask thing has become so huge. It has become so divisive and so political. But Christianity has always been political. So to shy away from that does not help anyone. To say we've always been political may be a shock to you, but consider the ramifications of following Jesus in Paul's day. He was arrested for it. He was arrested for basically treason. That was a political crime. Jesus was executed, crucified as a political criminal because he was inciting riots and he was committing treason by saying, I am who you say I am. That was an insurrection. That was a political crime of the day, and his followers were persecuted and followed and eventually killed for the same thing. That being a Christian has and always will be political when we say that we belong to a different kingdom, that we are a part of an earthly kingdom, that our allegiances are to our Creator in heaven and not to humanity, the principalities of the day. But how does that connect with this governmental authority thing? Well, let's dive into it. I said we'd talk about this, and we're going to deal with it. Let's talk about mask wearing. Now, on one hand, you may appreciate and understand that the government made this decision, and perhaps based on what Paul said, it is because it is the moral and ethical thing to do. And you don't have to agree with it, but it is what the government said. It is what, according to Paul, perhaps we're supposed to do, just like paying taxes. And the reason why is because it doesn't cause us to violate the law of God. Nothing about wearing a mask violates your faith. If anything, it might be an affirmation that you're trying to love your neighbor, because that's why I've asked you to do it this entire time. That is the legacy I would like us to leave. If the government were to say, denounce your faith in Jesus and call the president, whoever it is, your savior, that would violate a known law of God. That's why Paul didn't do it. That's why Paul went to jail. That is when you have to choose who you will serve. But right now, masks, the worst thing that could happen if you wear one is you're going to be slightly inconvenienced. If you don't, though, it could cause real actual damage. Wearing a mask, wearing a basic surgical mask, I'm sure there's plenty of arguments that you've heard about. If I wear this, I'm not especially protected. This isn't an N95 mask, but what this does is it captures the droplets that come out of my mouth. And since we still don't know everything we know about this virus, one of the things that most in the medical field would say they do agree on is that droplets are the most effective way to spread it. That's why if people have, I can't remember what it's called, my wife sent me the name of it. If you didn't know, my wife's a nurse, and this stuff really concerns her because this is her regular life. If you have something called neotropenic, I'm going to butcher that. She's going to laugh at me when she watches this. I don't know. There's a consideration where basically if a person comes in and they're immune compromised, this was long before the coronavirus, the nurses and doctors would wear this. And it wasn't to protect the nurse or doctor, it was to protect that patient from the nurse or doctor. These things stop spit from coming out of your mouth. They prevent you from giving it to somebody else. And right now, there's an increasing amount of people that are my age getting this thing. So maybe we still have something left to figure out here. N95 masks, they prevent 95% of stuff that could hurt you from getting in. But they don't necessarily filter your air coming out. Which is why they're saying people like me should wear this. This is why, without exception, almost every medical professional will tell you you should wear this right now for the sake of other people around you. This is why, if you've ever had surgery, the doctor wore this. Now, you could have probably said, like I've seen some people say of these masks, you get your liberal, left-leaning, blah, blah, blah out of this surgery room. I don't want you to wear a mask. But obviously, that's not why the doctor wore the mask. There's no brainwashing. There's no nonsensical ridiculousness. This is simply a precaution. And the most that you could ever be inconvenienced for wearing it is simply having to deal with it on your face. That's the worst thing that could happen from wearing this. This violation of constitutional rights, these First Amendment, that I genuinely don't care about those arguments because I want to follow Jesus and do what he says, and he says love other people as yourself. Now that yourself thing, this is why I feel so strongly about it. At this moment, I have 3 women that are pretty important to me in my life that are directly affected by the coronavirus. And these protests, Black Lives Matter, or protests against gathering, whether people are wearing this or not, it's affecting their situations. One of these women is my grandmother. And because of some outside reason, I'm not exactly sure, but someone brought it in because someone wasn't taking precautions. The place that she lives is being hammered with coronavirus. And now my grandmother, she has the coronavirus, and she is in the most vulnerable, immune-compromised demographics. So I would hope that people that are around her can just be mildly inconvenienced enough to wear this. But they didn't, and now she has it. Now what's more, my mother, you may know, has been fighting cancer for the last 5 years, and because it's probably a little much to ask everyone else around her to wear a mask until now, she has worn this for her own protection. But now, since she doesn't have the option but to go out and continue to receive life-saving radiation in the midst of a crazy explosion of cases in Arizona, she has to risk her life because people don't want to be inconvenienced. Despite how high a filtration her mask may have, there might be people around her that are just not caring about what effect they could have on someone else. So my mom has to risk people for life-saving radiation, being around people that might not care very much what they can do to other people. And my wife, she knows countless nurses that would agree with this. She knows nurses in Arizona right now that are begging people to take it seriously because their hospitals are at max capacity. And it's frustrating for me that my wife puts her life on the line And oftentimes it's because of people that just couldn't give a rip. That my wife has to be next to this virus. And she can't pass judgment. She can't say, well, you deserve it because you weren't taking precautions, and she never would. But I get a little upset about it because then she has to worry about bringing it home. What we do affects other people now more than ever. What we're willing to sacrifice could actually be life-saving. As Christians, we have been told time and time again to practice self-sacrificing love. This is what Jesus says over and over again. This is what Paul is talking about. He's saying love doesn't do anything wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is what fulfills the law. So I'm just going to put it out there as blunt as I can. Stop being selfish. Stop using the Bible to justify your selfish opinion. Start living your faith. It's pretty cut and dry. Right now, churches across the country, pastors like me, are calling for you to practice self-sacrificing love by wearing something like this, because it could affect somebody in a way you might not know about. If your kid was immune compromised and your doctor said, for the sake of your child, you should wear a mask, you could see that very simply as an act of self-sacrificing love. And that probably wouldn't be a big deal. If your wife or your husband worked in the medical field and they were being overrun with cases because people are not choosing to take precautions, it might bother you. If your mother or your father has a significantly compromised immune system, you will probably do this. So why can't we do it for our neighbor? If we can love our kid, can we love our neighbor? If Paul is saying that God put these systems in place so that the law of love could be upheld, why would we fight against it? Is wearing a mask really a compromise of faith? This is a big deal, because right now we are dealing with something we don't know the end to. We don't know how it will affect us going forward as a church. I don't know how it will affect me as a pastor. But I know right now the hope, the encouragement, the silver lining to all of this is that God appreciates it when we do what He says. That God has made it very clear this is what He wants His followers to do. And that for me is the most important thing, that there is hope in loving neighbor as self. That science, this pursuit of truth, affirms it. That if we love our neighbors well by taking precautions, we might mitigate some of the loss of life. And Jesus Himself, He makes it clear that sacrificial love is the end-all be-all. That's where I'll leave you today with a final quote. John 15:13. You can consider this your benediction. You can consider it what you want, but this is my final thought for you from the mouth of the Son of God Himself. This is my commandment. This is John 15:12 and 13. That you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for their friends. I read that from the New King James Version because I know most of us have grown up hearing it used that way. But I would hope and pray that phrase, that what Jesus says would echo in your brain, that it would bother you. It would be a reality check for all of us. I don't like wearing these either. Jesus says sacrificing our life for somebody else is what real love is. So is it too much to ask to do something as basic and simple as wearing a mask and be slightly inconvenienced? What legacy will we leave? What kind of church will we be? What will we be known for? One last thought. For what it's worth, I went and bought masks today for our gathering. So today we're Today's Saturday, but tomorrow, Sunday, which will be today when you watch this, we're opening the sanctuary for prayer, for reflection. And I went into the store to buy these masks because that's what we're supposed to do. And the clerk knew who I was and knew who our church was. You want to know why? Because we decided to give tacos to kids. Not because of our opinions on a mask. That, church family, that is the gospel.